And he knows.
It's just very strange because he posts so much like early in the morning.
Yeah.
Also like the social media is back to hello.
Hi there.
No, and it's so crazy because he had his rush business last year.
Do you want to put your name down for a participation point? Pass the sheet around.
What?
You good?
¿Has conocido a Brian?
Good.
No.
No, I just wasn't sort of and I went away like
I think people siempre está viviendo en nuestra adolescencia. Y después estuvo haciendo un montón de cosas. Y pues sus padres decidieron hacer escuela y ya está por ahí. No, that's it. No.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I'm going through your Hobbes essays, so it'll take me some time to go through them all, but I've done about a third so far. So those will be available for you to review. I remind you, you have the Locke essay coming up at the end of this week. And the material we're covering today, which is the Jean-Jacques Rousseau text, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, that essay won't be due for, if you want to write on this material, for several weeks. So what we're going to do is record today's lecture, and we're going to post it online. As part of that exercise, I had a class this morning. We started in on the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Lots of stuff to say about this extraordinary text. I did not get through all of that material, so my plan is to get through the material that I didn't cover this morning, this afternoon. So you're going to get half a lecture, basically. And then if you want to round out the story, if you're super committed, and I know you all are, hyper keen, you can watch that. You can also find out how I discovered today that there's a singer/poet, apparently, named Rosalia, who I'd never heard of before. Interesting experience encountering her music, her artistry this morning as part of my, part of waking up. I don't know if I recommend that. Certainly not if you're 50. Anyway, in any event, so that's all in the recording that's from this morning. Thank you very much. So I want to give you a very quick overview, as best I can, of what I discussed this morning, and then I'm going to jump into the parts that I did not cover, which are essentially parts 1 and 2. There are only 2 parts to the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, so that makes it sound like it didn't get very far. But I had a lot to say about the beginning part of the text. So broadly speaking, well, let me first state that last year I taught the social contract, and as you know, because of the format that we've employed this year, although a lot of our classes are in this NCL format, we've been able to open up some space in our curriculum for extra material that we couldn't cover last time, or that I didn't cover last year. So this text is one. Next time we have, or coming up, we have the Wollstonecraft text, which is perhaps the text I'm most happy to be able to put into our curriculum, and de Tocqueville's famous Democracy in America, none of which I was able to get to last year. So this is it's nice to have this extra space so we can cover these topics. That said, in the offline lectures on Rousseau's social contract, I give you an overview of who Rousseau was, the context of his life and his writings, and so on. So I'm not going to do that for you here today. We're just going to basically jump straight into the text, and you can listen to the social contract, the first lecture in which I sort of discuss the general context of Rousseau's life and work. I also, at a sort of broad level, engage both the second discourse, the discourse on inequality, and the so-called first discourse, which he wrote on the meaning of the arts and sciences to man. I discussed that as well in that lecture. So we'll give you a little bit of the context you need maybe to understand what's happening here. So what I want to do is I want to give you a quick overview of what I discussed this morning, and then we're going to jump into the consideration of parts 1 and 2 of this essay that he wrote. I'll note he wrote this essay as in response to a prize or a competition that was being sponsored by a French journal called Le Mercure de France on whether the origins of inequality were natural or not, right? In other words, are we destined by nature to live in a state of inequality? And from that basic question, Russo then constructed this entire essay, this entire exercise, a very iconoclastic argument, we might say, to consider that question of whether inequality should be considered natural, which leads him then to ask the question, well, what is natural? And that's really, we might say, the main protagonist of this text. How do we understand what is natural? Once we can understand that, then we can, as it were, proceed out with a wider investigation. So this text is critical to read in conjunction with the social contract, because the agenda in the social contract responds to the problems that Rousseau lays out by the end of the discourse on the origin of inequality. He did not necessarily write them in a sort of schematic sense, or so that one is supposed to follow from the other, any kind of procedural explanation of civil society and the kinds of politics we should reach for. But the kinds of things that Rousseau wants to talk to us about in the social contract spring or stem naturally from some of the problems, in fact, many of the problems that he identifies here in the discourse on the origin of inequality. So I've got lots of stuff that I want to address your attention to in parts 1 and 2. So let me quickly give you a summary of what I discussed this morning. This is a text that's actually in 4 parts, although there's only 2 parts to the discourse. There's actually 4 parts. The first part is a dedication that Rousseau writes to the citizens of Geneva, where Rousseau was born. He's not actually French, he's Swiss. So the first part of the text consists of a dedication to the citizens of Geneva, city of Geneva, in which he lays out in encomiastic terms, meaning praising terms, praises the city for what he identifies as being all these features of the city of Geneva as a form of ideal republic, an almost Platonic exercise of Callipolis sitting there on the shores of Lake Geneva. It's all a lie. The city of Geneva looks nothing like how Rousseau describes it at the beginning of the text. So it's a very sarcastic dedication. He praises Geneva for the way it safeguards liberties and all the rest of it. None of that is true. But it nonetheless is interesting because it gives us at the beginning of the text what we might call Rousseau's vision of an ideal state. This is what it means to live inside of an ideal state. And by the time you get to the end of the discourse, you can come back to that beginning and see, as it were, the glimmers of how we might advance a positive political science that comes out of his discussion. If this is all the bad stuff, how do we then make it better, right? And he doesn't fill that gap in, but he tells us what better looks like in the dedication. This is what it looks like to be in an ideal state. Sovereign citizen have the same interests, that freedom is preserved, that the laws are not overly burdensome, and so on. In the second part, he has a preface to the discourse, And there he lays out this question of knowledge. How do we know things? How do we know, this question of, like, if we're going to answer this question on whether inequality is natural, how do we know what that means? What is natural? And so he lays out this, what we might call an epistemological problem. How do we acquire knowledge? Or maybe we'd call it a hermeneutical problem, which is how do we interpret what we know? And both of those inform the preface. Although it's very short, it's full of important stuff with respect to the rest of the work. Because what he wants to tell us is that what we think we may know of humanity, of human beings, who we are, and how we think, and how we feel, and all of our engagement with the world, that in fact, we are very, what he calls, disfigured by society itself. That when we look at ourselves and think that there's some way for us to, given who we are today, construct or reconstruct some image of who we were in a primitive or natural state, that in fact that exercise is extremely difficult because we are, and he compares man to a statue that's been disfigured or discolored by weather. He says that society has exercised this change over us in such a way that we don't resemble anything at all like who we were in a state of nature. And that person that he calls in a state of nature, he refers to them as original man. So part of the exercise here for Russo is to rediscover, or maybe we should say to discover who we were as original man. And I apologize, but I'm going to use Rousseau's own gendered language from time to time in this discussion. But I hope that my natural tendency to inclusion is nonetheless acknowledged. So this sense then that we cannot know who we are, and I want to draw attention to a point I made this morning because it's important when we turn our attention to Nietzsche, and those of you in the room who are drawn to these kind of large, big philosophical ideas, you'll enjoy Nietzsche as well as Rousseau. Nietzsche starts his text on the genealogy of morals in exactly the same way. If Rousseau is telling us, how do we understand who we were in a natural sense? What is the natural condition of man? And therefore, the first problem we have to get through is this question of how do we know the things we know? Nietzsche does exactly the same thing. If we want to interpret ourselves as beings who have inherited a certain understanding of morality, the problem is that we do not know ourselves, as he calls us kenner, those who know, and we have this fundamental problem of knowing. So in other words, these kinds of things that surround us, that we think define who we are in fact hidden from us in a way, that the real truth lies someplace else. And that's then the exercise in parts 1 and 2 of the discourse, having established this vision of an ideal city and problematized the question of how we know things. The rest of the discourse consists of an attempt by Rousseau to describe what man actually looks like in a proper state of nature. And then having done that, to then describe the process whereby inequality arises out of that state of nature. And at the end, he wants to make the argument for us that inequality is a feature of living in civil society. We have developed as a function of or as we might say, over the process of being, as a function of our humanity, we have actually created inequality, and then civil society enshrines that inequality as a central artifact of what it means to be inside of some kind of civilization. So the first part of the discourse consists then of this inquiry, what does it mean to be inside of a state of nature? Now, Rousseau, writing as he is in the middle of the 18th century, an Enlightenment thinker, sort of a product of that larger time. He was an associate, for example, of Diderot, who was famous for having spearheaded the famous project of the Encyclopédie, to which, in fact, Rousseau contributed a number of articles, mostly on music. So Rousseau is very much a product of this kind of Enlightenment period. And as part of that larger Enlightenment project, there was this notion that humankind had, for the first time across its long history, acquired the capacity to move itself forward, because it was no longer being held back by superstition and what Voltaire liked to call barbarism. In other words, attitudes or understandings or explanations that lie outside of reason and instead reach to metaphysical or simply superstitious bases for explanation. So a large component of the Enlightenment project, if we can consider it generally, is this notion of man advanced by the use of his or her reason. And it was a standard feature of Enlightenment thinking that this nature, this idea of reason, was a universal human artifact, a universal feature of our humanity. It's just that up until the Enlightenment, we did not have the tools, we were not in the environment that enabled us to leverage that reason in a way that helped promote the benefit of humanity as a whole. This was not just then the idea of a private reason, the ability to look at something and ask critical questions about it, but more importantly, a public reason, public use of reason, reason in the public square, helping advance the conversation forward so that people can come together, share their opinions, and arrive at some better condition. It's interesting then that Rousseau, and if you are, as I iterated this morning, if you are interested in leveraging your inner iconoclasm and your inner creativity, if you feel you are propelled with a kind of intellectual energy that wants you to look critically upon the world, then this text, when you finally get around to reading it, as I hope you will, this discourse on the origin of inequality will speak deeply to you, because not only for what it says, but the way it says it embeds the kind of energy that I think creative iconoclasts ever since have been channeling. And as a central feature of that energetic iconoclasm in Rousseau is the fact that he takes this concept of reason, which lies at the very center of the Enlightenment project, of which he is an active and self-conscious member, And he historicizes reason, far from being accepting of the idea that reason exists as a universal feature of the human self, as we for example saw in Aristotle, who distinguishes our humanity by virtue of the fact that we have logos or reason. Instead, Rousseau claims audaciously that reason emerges as a function of our own history, that there was a period in our history where we did not have, or at least did not use our reason. So reason becomes this kind of important protagonist for explaining how we got from one state, a primitive state, a natural state, the state of the original man, into the sorry state that we are in today. And by today, I mean 1755, when Rousseau published this essay. And what was that sorry state? For Rousseau, it was pretty clear. You may recall, those of you who, I know some of you are planning to write the essay on Locke, I'd like to take first words from texts. Has anyone watched the Locke lectures yet? Does anyone know, either here or online, the very first word of the first treatise of government by John Locke? The very first word, anyone? What? No, that was Hobbes. Reason. Nope. I give you points for guessing, and I give you points for at least having watched one of the lectures. Anyone? Yes.
Is it the pursuit of happiness?
Nope. That's the American Constitution.
It's nature, right?
No, that's Hobbes. It's slavery, right? It's slavery is the first word. In the first treatise, he attacks Robert Filmer's absurd defense of patriarchy, patriarcha, in which he claims that the divine right of kings descends from Adam, the first man. And Locke argues this line of reasoning is no better than a form of slavery. Well, for Rousseau, the condition in which we're living, or people are living in 1755, is precisely that. It is essentially slavery. I shouldn't even say essentially, it is slavery. This is what he describes it as. So the question is, how did we go from the state of nature where man is free into this state of enslavement? And in that context, you'll see that there's a distinction between what we've already seen in Hobbes and Locke, even though Rousseau's text can be read coherently and cogently next to both of those texts, because Rousseau's engaging many of the same questions and indeed using many of the same features of the intellectual apparatus that those earlier authors had constructed as part of their own project of constructing a political theory. But whereas Hobbes sees leaving the state of nature, we move into a state of peace, and Locke sees us leaving the state of nature to move into a world that is, as he puts it, more convenient, capable of safeguarding the liberties of the individual through the sacrosanct role of property inside the state. For Rousseau, the act of leaving the state of nature, moving into civil society, is an act of self-enslavement. And it is that iconoclasm, that civilization is slavery, that then not only sets up the social contract, helps to explain the substance of his dedication, but gives him this central role as such an iconoclastic thinker of the 18th century. It explains a little bit, at least, why after the French Revolution, which involved a fundamental redrawing of the core basis upon which we constructed politics, Rousseau was so popular that the French Revolution, the redrawing of political life, political society in France after 1789, was in part to get rid of or to extirpate this sort of condition of slavery that had persisted in feudal France up until the moment of the revolution. Indeed, what is the great rallying cry of the French revolutionaries? What are the three parts of the French Revolution? Égalité, fraternity, and liberty, right? All three of which, if you will, the antidote to slavery. Everyone is your brother. We are all free. We are all one, right? That kind of an idea. So in the first part of this discourse on the origin of inequality, Rousseau turns his attention to then this question of who we are in a state of nature. Now, we've already seen this as a thought experiment at the heart of the Hobbesian and Lockean projects, that both Hobbes and Locke use the state of nature as a convenient artifact, a convenient element against which to then imagine civil society, right? State of nature, civil society, flip sides, two possibilities of living your life. And we saw that for both of them then, the idea is that the question of civil society is how we leave the state of nature in order for us to advance into a better way, a better mode of existence. Although Rousseau characterizes his discussion of the state of nature as not factual and hypothetical, which he does at the beginning of the first part of the discourse, It is better for us to think of it as what the French used to call in the 18th century, histoire conjecturelle, or conjectural history, history that we can imagine happening. And the idea here was that you would see something, you could observe something, and then you could use what you observed to, as it were, reconstruct a past that is otherwise hidden. So for instance, when French, or when European travelers, explorers as they were, went and found, for instance, societies living on the islands of Tahiti, and they found a very different kind of sexual behavior on the part of the islanders. One of the things you could do in observing that much more promiscuous sexual behavior was use it as the basis for arguing that the morality that existed in 18th century Europe, far from being universal, was some kind of learned morality, that maybe it was possible that in another phase of our existence, human beings had practiced a different form of sexual self-expression, had different conceptions of the family and the like. That's a classic example of histoire conjecturelle, my example drawn from the work, in that case, of Denis Diderot. So in this case, Rousseau is doing something of the same thing. Although he argues that this is not a factual-based discussion of who original man was in the state of nature, that it is hypothetical, nonetheless, the idea here is that we can actually make some kind of meaningful claims about early primitive human beings, how we lived before we became disfigured to the point of non-recognition by society itself and by the knowledge that man had accumulated as a function of that civilizing process. He then situates his discussion of the state of nature over and against the work of people like Hobbes and Locke, who had used this concept, as we know from having just finished reading them, used this concept in the elaboration of their own political discussion. And I want to read to you what he says. I read it this morning, but I'll read it again. He says, the philosophers, and by philosophers, let's just say Hobbes and Locke, who have examined the foundations of society have all perceived the necessity of tracing it back to a state of nature, but not one of them has ever got there. So that tells you that the state of nature as described by Hobbes, the war of all against all, or the state of nature as described by Locke, characterized by the law of nature, but with certain inconveniences and so on, that note that the philosophers who engage in this exercise have not actually described the state of nature. All of them, in fine, constantly harping on wants, avidity, oppression, desires, and pride, have transferred to the state of nature ideas picked up at the heart of society. In speaking of savages, they describe citizens. So what's the problem? What have they done? They've imagined people in a state of nature, not coming out of a state of nature as their original state, but people being put back into a state of nature, having already acquired certain knowledge that comes about as a function of civilization. For example, we see that Locke places property at the very center of his political idea. But if property didn't exist inside the state of nature, as Locke claims it does, but if property didn't exist, then his entire political construct, right, becomes invalidated. What evidence does he have for arguing that we created property inside of a state of nature? For Russo, it's straightforward. The evidence is that when we're in a civil society, of course we have property. Therefore, property must itself be natural. But that's putting the cart before the horse. It's taking a conclusion and placing it at the origins of things. When Hobbes describes the war of all against all in the state of nature and argues that when we come across each other, that we're characterized by mistrust and fear and envy and a desire for glory, how does he know that original man was capable of any of those things, had the capacity for a desire for glory or envy or all these things? In other words, they have taken people who are already, as it were, characterized by these civilizing forces and then put them back into a state of nature. This is not the real state of nature. The real state of nature needs to start with an inquiry of who we are at the deepest and most profound level. In other words, start from nature and then put man inside of it as he might have been in the context of our own evolution. So it's not purely hypothetical. It's not without consideration of the fact. For Rousseau, it's a real kind of history. He wants to ask that question. If we went back 50,000 years ago and had the opportunity to meet people in this original state, who would we have found? That's not, as I say, that's not a kind of thought experiment. It's much more a kind of exercise in conjectural history. So when he says, let us begin by laying aside facts, for they do not affect the question, and that the researchers in which we may engage on this occasion are merely hypothetical and conditional reasonings, Rousseau is in a way covering himself a little bit because it's not truly consistent with then his subsequent discussion. And I finished my discussion this morning on this phrase, which I'll now repeat, and then I can move from there, which is when he's speaking to his readership, when he's asking you to reading his work, to come with him on this exercise, on this journey, which is going to be quite extraordinary as he topples one after another what seem like common sense understandings of the world around us. He speaks to us directly. He says, "Oh man," and I'll say, "Oh woman," or however you identify on a spectrum. "Oh man, person, of whatever country you are, whatever your opinions may be, attend to my words. Listen to what I have to say. Here is your history. This is where you come from. The original man is your descendant. Here is your history, such as I think I have read it, not in books composed by your fellow men, for they are liars, but in the book of nature, which never lies." Let's go back to actually natural conditions, and from there, let's see what kind of thing emerges. So from that sort of robust beginnings, Rousseau then turns his attention to this question of who we are in the state of nature. Natural man, we might call it, the original man. Like Hobbes, Rousseau agrees that man in this state of nature is characterized by a kind of radical equality, that there is no such thing as a naturally granted inequality in the state of nature. You may recall that for Hobbes, he established this idea in the state of nature that no one person can claim power over any other person by dint or by virtue of some natural superiority. No one is your natural better by virtue of who they are physically. And Rousseau agrees with this notion that there is a kind of natural equality inside of the state of nature. And it's important to note, and this comes out in the preface, which I'll mention here because it's going to form our discussion going forward, that in this original condition, that man for Rousseau lives, let's call it, outside of a state of reason. We do not use, or we're not rational beings as we understand it in the context of a civil society. We're not rational beings in a state of nature. It's not to say that we're irrational. We have as it were, the faculties of reason that occur naturally. Is we have no use of our reason. We don't need to use it. Insofar as it is our reason that solves problems, creates innovations, leads to ingenious solutions and the like. In this purest sense, the purest state of nature for Rousseau, we don't need to use our reason in that sense because there is no necessity for it. Because in this context for Rousseau, we live in a kind of equilibrium with our environment. And insofar as we are in equilibrium, what is the need, therefore, to change the circumstances or the conditions or the modes of your life? Essentially, one day looks a lot like the next, and as long as you can secure the basic things that you need, in this context, then you will have little use of reason. And it is for this, or it is based on that argument, that Rousseau suggests that there are two principles that define the original man in a state of nature before reason. The first is that we obviously seek to preserve ourselves, right? And this we can all agree that we have a natural inclination to secure our own existence. And the second principle for Rousseau, a natural principle, is that we are averse to seeing things that look like us, fellow human beings, indeed fellow animals, suffer. We have an aversion to suffering. We don't have a moral obligation to stop it, but we are averse to suffering. So you may recall that for Locke, he had these two ideas, that we preserve ourselves and we preserve all mankind. This for Locke was the law of nature. You recall that in Locke, the law of nature was, for Locke, reason itself. Reason informs us that we must preserve ourselves and preserve all mankind. Rousseau takes us back a step. We don't even need reason in order for us to recognize that preserving ourselves is simply the function of our day-to-day activity. And preserving all mankind is actually itself rests on a much more basic supposition, which is we are averse to seeing things that look like us suffer. It's just a feature of who we are, and we do not need reason to figure that out. In fact, not only that, he goes further. He says that in this state of equilibrium, in a natural state, he says In that nature intended we should always enjoy good health, I dare almost affirm that a state of reflection, thinking about things, is a state against nature, and that man who meditates is a degenerate animal. Let me read that again. I dare almost affirm that a state of reflection is a state against nature, and that the man who meditates is a degenerate animal. So the next time you see somebody engaging in mindfulness or something like that, you can point your finger at them and say, Russo said, you are a degenerate animal, right? Which is not very mindful of you, but there you go. So the point is, we don't need to think in this state of equilibrium, right? We are simply doing. We go out and we secure our existence. We're not plagued by illness or by ill health and by constant anxiety, and so that we live in a kind of equilibrium with our existence. And those things that we associate then with reason have absolutely no place in helping us either secure our own existence or explain, as it were, the aversion that we see in the suffering, or that we have towards seeing the suffering of others. So in this basic state of nature, to come back to the nature of the question that Rousseau is answering, is inequality natural? You can see that in one sense, he's on the same page as Thomas Hobbes. There is no inequality associated with the state of nature in a natural sense. He then turns his attention in this first part to what he calls the metaphysical and moral life of man in a state of nature. So if the natural condition of man in a state of nature is to be in equilibrium with their environment, so what about the moral condition that we have? And here, Rousseau introduces us to those features that are inside of us, which will eventually disturb our condition inside of the state of nature as he's reading this, as this kind of proto-anthropological or maybe proto-archaeological exercise on the state of early man. He writes, I can discover nothing in any animal but an ingenious machine to which nature has given senses to wind itself up and guard to a certain degree against everything that might destroy or disorder. We might think that in this sense, he's sort of anticipating someone like Darwin, that in other words, we are well adapted to our environments, much like a machine is well adapted to a function. I perceive the very same things in the human machine. So we too are also well adapted to our environment. But we have this difference. Whereas animals react in nature based on instinct, we have this capacity to be what Rousseau calls free agents. We're not just shaped by the world around us, but we have, by virtue of our free agency, the capacity to shape it. Nature alone operates in all the operations of the beast. Animals are completely surrounded by the natural conditions. Whereas man, as a free agent, has a share in his. One chooses, so animals choose by instinct, but we, human beings, we act as a function of our liberty, or what we might call today probably our consciousness. We have a consciousness that enables us to act. And so the result is that when we arrive at some kind of a problem, whereas in nature, for beasts or animals that don't have this benefit of free agency of consciousness, that whatever problem emerges will simply result either in them overcoming it through adaptation or dying off. We have the capacity then to solve the problems that we encounter, a bad harvest or an inavailability of food or whatever it might be. We can actually, as it were, become more, we're not determined by the nature that is around us. And this capacity then to change the things around us based on the kinds of problems that we may encounter in the world of nature, Rousseau describes as perfectibilité. And that sounds like I'm just being pretentious by using the French word, which again, to go back to when we come to Nietzsche, you'll see that Nietzsche uses also a French word in his text, ressentiment, which sounds a bit pretentious. But the reason that Nietzsche uses it in French, and the reason I use it in French here, is it doesn't actually have a very good English translation. It doesn't mean, at least as Rousseau is using it, it does not mean perfectibility. It may capture something of the sense of improvement, but it's improvement in the sense of against some kind of immediate circumstance or condition. If you see, I don't know, a river that you'd like to cross and you don't have the means to cross it, and you get some friends together and you construct some kind of rudimentary bridge that allows you then to reach the river. That would be an example of using our free agency and perfectibility, ability to solve problems, as it were, using our own craftiness. And it's these two elements, this idea of liberty and improvement or perfectibility, that is the fundamental qualities that distinguish human beings from other animals in the state of nature. And so whereas other animals have continued to persist in that state of nature, pretty much as they always have, it's man and man alone, or human beings and human beings alone, which have then been able, as it were, to redefine their relationship to each other and to their environment from that state of nature. In other words, there's a movement, this capacity for motion, for evolution, for change that is embedded inside of that state of nature. He says, even if the difficulties, he says there is another very specific quality that distinguishes human beings from animals, a quality which will admit of no dispute, that is the faculty of improvement or perfectibility, a faculty which, as circumstances offer, successively unfolds all the other faculties, the capacity to see a problem and then use our ingenuity and so on to solve. Today we might say the capacity of problem solving. And so it's at this moment when our liberty and our capacity for perfectibility come together, at this point we start to use our reason. Right? This is when our reason now comes into play inside of the state of nature. He says shortly thereafter, he says, let moralists say what they will, the human understanding is greatly indebted to the passions, which on their side are likewise universally allowed to be greatly indebted to the human understanding. This notion of passion, your emotions and so on. It is by the activity of our passions that our human reason improves. We covet knowledge because we covet enjoyment. We covet knowledge, and it is impossible to conceive why a man exempt from fears and desires should take the trouble to reason. So if we see a river that we'd like to cross and we're troubled by the fact that we can't get across it, in other words, we have an emotional response to the inconvenience that represents, then we use our reason, as it were, to solve the problem. If I'm feeling some kind of pain, I can use my reason to make that issue go away. As long as I'm living contentedly in equilibrium with my environment, my reason provides me with little value. But once I have genuine problems to solve that derive from a kind of emotional state of unease or anxiety, at that point, reason kicks in. And it's this that Russo says, our reason improves. So if you think about that, our reason improves. This is the historicization of reason. Reason, or the development of reason, is part of the trajectory of the human experience. That it's not that we had perfectly formed rational faculties, but instead our ability to leverage what reason grants us changes over time. I have to say, it's an interesting observation that Rousseau is making here, what now, almost 300 years ago, because there's a theory in terms of how early human development happened around the time of the Neolithic Revolution, which is sometimes called the cognitive revolution, which seems to then make reference to this Rousseau idea of an advancing capacity for reason and our ability to change our world as a result of developing cognition. But generally speaking, for Rousseau, the original man, so our man inside of this state of nature, as he says, this original man knows no goods but food, a female, and rest. He fears no evils but pain and hunger. I say pain and not death, for no animal merely as such will ever know what it is to die. And the knowledge of death and of its terrors is one of the first acquisitions made by man in consequence of his deviating from an animal state. So if we take this together, what are we saying? We're saying that there is that humanity existed inside of a state of nature prior to reason, uninfluenced by all the things that reason has now subsequently provided for us. That is who the original man is. And the things that come out of reason, like, for example, the concept of property or ownership or glory or honor or reputation, all of that stuff doesn't exist, are not characteristics that we would write back onto man in a state of nature. Those all come subsequently. This is who we truly are. If we go back then and consider the project or consider the argument, the logic that's put forward to us by a Hobbes or by a Locke, and we strip out, say, from Hobbes the idea of reputation or glory and so on, then there is no reason for us to construct the state as Hobbes would have us do based on this reading of the state of nature. It's instead finding ourselves in a state of nature once we've already been tarnished by civil society, that we then have this urge, as it were, to improve or to find a better kind of political solution. Another implication against Aristotle is that the original man in Rousseau's conception has no need of politics. In fact, Rousseau goes so far, I have to say somewhat questionably, but goes so far as to argue that we're not social inside of this state of nature. We don't seek out necessarily the company of other people. It's not necessary to who we are. In fact, he even goes so far as to refute the natural origins of what Locke called conjugal society, mating pairs, people getting together over long periods of time. Instead, he argues that we connected only so long as was necessary for the successful reproduction of our children, and after that, we took off and left. So in other words, there are all of these elements that have been part of the state of nature as it characterized in previous discussions. They don't apply in Rousseau's argument. This is not fundamentally who we are. He says, whatever these origins of language may have been, we may at least infer from the little care which nature has taken to bring men together by mutual wants and make the use of speech easy to them, how little she has done towards making them, us, people, sociable, and how little nature has contributed to anything which they themselves have done to become so. That sociability, coming together, is not a natural thing, but something that is a construct of human beings evolving using their free agency and perfectibility over time. He says, I know we are continually told that in the state of nature, man has been the most wretched of all creatures. Who argued that man was super wretched in a state of nature? Who did we just finish reading? Hobbes, exactly. And yet, he says, in civil life, we scarcely meet a single person who's not constantly complaining of his existence. Was ever any free savage? By savage, this notion, you know, the Russo notion of the noble savage, he means somebody who lives outside of civil society. Was ever any free savage, sauvage, known to have been so much tempted to complain of life and to do away with himself? Let us therefore judge with less pride on which side real misery is to be placed. So the notion even of having a sense of happiness, contentment, etc., is again one of these artifacts that comes out of civil society. That it's in civil society that we acquire the notion of what it is to be happy, because we're also capable of being miserable so much of the time. Whereas in a state of nature, original man knew no such thing. There was no happiness, there was no misery. It was simply this kind of equilibrium, a life unfolding in the context of this environment. It appears at first sight there were no kind of moral relations between men in this state, nor any known duties. They could not be either good or bad, and had neither vices nor virtues. Which sounds a bit like Hobbes. Hobbes tells us there's no justice, right? There's no just or unjust inside of the state of nature. But that's not quite what Rousseau is telling us, right? There were no moral relations between men in this state, or any kind of duties. We have an aversion to seeing suffering. That alone is enough to prevent us from causing needless harm upon other people. But there's no moral idea for Rousseau. Morality is itself a construction of civil society. So by the time we get through to the end of this first discourse, what we've received from Rousseau is this vision that, in fact, all of those elements that have previously informed discussions of the state of nature are irrevocably flawed because they're contaminated by the elements of civilization itself. They therefore do not describe truly what the qualities are of individuals, of people, humans, inside of the state of nature. In fact, he even goes so far as to attack Hobbes specifically. Says Hobbes did not consider the same cause which hinders savages from making use of their reason as our jurisconsults pretend, hinders them at the same time from making an ill use of their faculties, as he himself claims, so that we may say that savages are not bad precisely because they do not know what it is to be good. For it is neither the development of the understanding nor the curb of the law, but the calmness of their passions and their ignorance of vice that hinder them from doing ill. So this idea in Hobbes of a world of the war of all against all, and people in the state of nature who are engaging in these essentially barbarities and brutalities, this is not realistic because the people who are living in such a state have no need for or whatever exercise such barbarism or such brutality. They don't understand the concept from Rousseau's perspective. And so by the time we get to the end of this, here is this argument that the state of nature does not embed within it this kind of inequality. We are not unequal, right? There is no such thing as inequality inside of the state of nature. That we are we're simply characterized by this kind of extended equilibrium in our environment. Makes a few other arguments, which I'll skip aside for the purposes of time, so we could jump to the second part, in which he then asks the question, where then does inequality come from? Actually, let me make one last point. This is quite nice. You may recall that Hobbes argues that there's the law of nature, obtainable by reason, right, which is do unto others. Well, first is to seek peace, and then second is do unto others as you have them do unto you. Well, for Russo, there is no law of nature obtainable by reason, because we're not using our reason yet. We have no need to use our reason. We don't need to think about obtaining peace because we de facto live in a state of peace. And this idea of doing unto others as you have them do unto you, he transforms that. He says, do good to yourself with as little prejudice as you can to others. This is the kind of maxim that exists inside of this state of nature. And insofar as we're not sociable beings, we're all living, sort of pursuing our own ends, that idea of doing as little prejudice, with as little prejudice to others would seem to sort of satisfy then these conditions that Rousseau lays out for us inside in the state of nature. As he says, if it were not this way, the preservation of human beings would have long ago ceased to exist, had it depended entirely for its preservation on the rational faculties of the individuals who make it up. Okay, let me jump to the second part. Are there any questions about that? Pause for a moment. Do you have any questions or comments about this? Okay. So it's pretty clear for Rousseau, inequality is not of natural origin, right? Inequality comes out from something else entirely. Where does inequality then come from? And in this, we get at the beginning of part 2, an unambiguous statement. It's one of the most famous things that Rousseau wrote. You probably know his famous phrase that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, which is the beginning of the social contract. I have to say Rousseau knew how to write a good first line. The beginning of the second part of the second discourse is a similarly resonant line. He writes, "The first man who, after enclosing a piece of ground, took it into his head to say, 'This belongs to me,' and found people stupid enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. How many crimes, how many wars, how many murders, how much misfortune and horror would that man have saved the entire human species, who, pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditches, should have cried to his fellow men, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong equally to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" So, from property is misery, right? I'm pretty unambiguous. So the first man, after enclosing a piece of ground, found people stupid enough to believe him. This is the source of all, as he says, crimes, wars, murders, misfortunes, and horrors that have afflicted the human species ever since. Now, you may recall that for Locke, the idea of property was that it was a natural extension of the self, right? That it comes out naturally from the self, and therefore we can argue that property is natural, right? This sort of idea of a natural condition of property, and it's those natural property rights that accrue that then inform the Lockean political project. That's why when we come out of the state of nature in Locke into civil society, we do so with the purpose of better securing the property rights that we're able to secure for ourselves also inside the state of nature. So it's not like we're changing radically from one state to another, from non-property holders to property holders, which is the case for Hobbes. For Locke, we saw that property exists just as a function of people's capacity for transforming the environment inside of a state of nature. Now, Russo doesn't necessarily disagree that labor transforms things and can give you the sense of making them yours. But there's a very big difference in Rousseau's idea of what property is than Locke's. You may recall that Locke extends this argument of property to include the accumulation or acquisition of things that go beyond merely the fulfillment of basic human needs. And from this, we then get the rise of money. And so for Locke, money is also a natural feature, a natural condition, because it stems from this element of property. For Rousseau, that idea of property, like a money economy or a money system capable of storing value for the purchase or exchange for other goods at a later time and so on, as he says, this idea of property depends on several prior ideas which could only spring up gradually one after another. It was not formed all at once in the human mind. Men must have made considerable progress, meaning this idea of perfectibilité. They must have acquired a great stock of industry and knowledge and transmitted and increased it from age to age before they could arrive at this last point of the state of nature, meaning state of nature that incorporates this idea of property within it. So whereas for Locke, property exists as a principle, as an original principle of living in a state of nature, for Rousseau, property is something that evolves over time, that requires that humanity undergo various kinds of transformations and eventually is capable of arriving at a sense of property. As we did so, as we gradually acquired that sense of property, goes through the various discussion, which is, I have to say, not particularly historical. Then we find that as we gradually evolve this notion of property out of a state of nature through this process of perfectibilité, that strange things start to happen to us as a species, as human beings. Our feelings about things and about other people start to change. He writes a little further along, given this sort of gradually evolving idea of ownership, of owning things, property, of things that are yours. Everyone began to notice everyone else and wish to be noticed herself. And public esteem acquired a value. What other people think of you now matters. He who sang or danced best, the handsomest, the strongest, the most dexterous. From these first distinctions, there arose on one side vanity, contempt, and on the other side envy and shame. And the fermentation raised by these new leavens at length produced combinations fatal to happiness and innocence. So this gradual acquisition of our understanding of property then carries with it transformations of the human self, gives us the capacity to be vain or proud or jealous or envious and the like. Men no sooner began to set a value upon each other and know what esteem was, than each laid claim to it, and it was no longer safe for any man to refuse it to another. We learned to be sanguinary, bloody, and cruel. Such precisely was the degree attained by most of the savage nations with whom we are acquainted. So when we go back and we look at, or when Rousseau's imagining that we encounter people who are a less advanced stage of development than, say, 18th century France was, what we're seeing are people who are in this process of acquiring a more advanced understanding of what it means to be property. From these observations, meaning observing, for example, Amerindian or Pacific Island populations, many authors, Hobbes again, have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel and requires a civil government to make him more gentle. Whereas nothing is more gentle than the human being in his or her primitive state. I'm trying to make Rousseau's language a little more inclusive here. When placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the pernicious enlightenment of civilized men. Where there is no property, there can be no injury. Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, you're not like protecting Hobbes, but he never said that men are like intrinsically evil. He said that we're just surrounded with like perpetual suspicion and state of war. Because of it, it influences us, like our inside, let's say, fear of it influences us to fight each other and not trust each other. That's why we need.
Well, he's not saying evil.
Yeah,
No, he didn't say evil, cruel.
okay.
Cruel. There's no morality, right? In this, Hobbes agrees with this. There's no morality in the
Yeah.
state of nature and so on. And Hobbes, and obviously Locke would agree, morality is created by the state. And I think Hobbes would argue that that is also true. But the point is that Hobbes does see us as when we come together, that we will be, I mean, he says as much, right? One covets the goods of another. One is envious of the glory that another has. Well, for Russo, those feelings of envy, coveting, so on, jealousy, they're all the product of this process. It's true that we see them in people who may live in somewhat less advanced societies as our own, but it's not like those people are also living as original men. They're simply not as far along this sort of stages, because the agency and perfectibility is a feature of all human beings. Put it this way, we can't ever stay in the state of nature in this purest sense by virtue of who we are. We are constructed, we have evolved in such a way to prevent ourselves from ever being able to stay in that state of equilibrium. But that is who we were, right? So that's the point. I don't know if I'm being precisely clear. The argument here is not to say, let's try and go back to some state of nature as it once was. That's not possible. We've changed too much, and having changed, we can't go back. Instead, it's to recognize what this process has done to us, so that we can, once we've historicized it, then at that point, we can better understand how to address it, or maybe we should say how to redress it in this sense. So in other words, all of these ideas that we encounter in people like Locke and Hobbes, all of them are artifacts of this process that is taking place. So the concept of natural law doesn't exist as far as Rousseau is concerned. Natural law, as Locke himself said, is reason, and reason itself is a function of this evolution. Property doesn't exist. It is also a function of this evolution. The relationship between people doesn't exist, as Aristotle would argue that politics comes out naturally from our capacity for logos and the way that we have social relations. That's not true either for Rousseau. That the original man in the state of nature is encumbered by none of those things. As he says, we must take notice that the society now formed and relations established among men required in them qualities different from those which they derived from their primitive state. That as a sense of morality began to insinuate itself into human actions, and every man before the enacting of laws was the only judge and avenger of the injuries he had received, that goodness of heart suitable to the pure state of nature by no means was suitable for the new society. So as we start to assemble into more complex forms of existence, we have to develop a kind of moral code to go with it. Whereas in our original state, we had no need for a moral code. When we come to Kant, we'll see the power of Rousseau's idea in forming Kant's own approach. Is it really true that human beings have no sense of, are not imminently moral, that we don't have a moral compass of any kind, that it's a purely learned, constructed behavior as a function of civil society? That idea bothered Kant a great deal. He wanted to ask that question, is there not a universal morality that exists inside of us, that deep down, whatever state we're in, whatever age we are, whatever language we speak, that we know when something is right and something is wrong, because morality is a universal feature of who we are. Rousseau would say absolutely not, that those categories that I've just mentioned, they don't even exist. But we'll see Kant pick that up again when we come to the groundwork on the metaphysics of morals, which I should note is a text very heavily influenced by Rousseau. I do not want to run out of time, so I don't have another class to do recordings. Okay, let me jump to some of the goodness stuff at the end. So all this to say, property, right, itself is a manifestation of this process. And along the route that developed into what was property, we see all these other things that are coming into being that corrupt or otherwise disturb who we were in our original state. Passions like envy, covetousness, the urge to be honored, the worry about our reputation, our desire for esteem, all of that stuff, right? For Rousseau is part of this process triggered by the fact that we have free agency and perfectibility. And gradually, at the end of that process, then we move fully into an idea of what is property. At that point, it becomes important to say, something is mine. This has a value. The value matters to me. I judge myself by the value that it is that it has acquired. Okay, let's look at the origins of civil society then, based on all of this. I will note, actually, in passing, that he does agree with Hobbes that there is something called the state of war. We saw Locke pick up on that. You may recall that in Hobbes, the state of in a state of nature was being in a state of war. For Rousseau, the state of war is a historical stage. It's only after we have acquired these ideas, these sensibilities, this capacity to be envious or covetousness of something else, that at that point we enter into a state of war. As he calls it a new state of society, a most horrible state of war. And mankind thus became what he calls debased and harassed. So as we evolve this element of property, at that point we move into the state of war. His discussion of then how civil society comes about is not, as it was for Hobbes, a function of serving peaceful ends that we may secure our existence in peace, nor, as for Locke, the idea that we may create a stable structure to enjoy and benefit from the use of our property, but instead comes about as an act of the inequality that has been emerging over time. He says, the rich man, thus pressed by necessity, at last conceived the deepest project that ever entered the human mind. This was to employ for himself in his favor the very forces that attacked it, to make allies of his enemies, to inspire them with other maxims, and make them adopt other institutions as favorable to his own claims as the law of nature was unfavorable to them. That's a kind of complex statement, but in other words, we might put it this way, that as this process is gradually creating through the emergence of property, some people who have more and some people who have less, leading to these mechanisms of jealousy, the kind of state of war that we saw described in Hobbes, that those who are wealthy, those who have more, thus conceive as a way of protecting what they've been able to acquire, what he calls the deepest project that ever entered into the human mind. With this view, after laying before his neighbors all the horrors of a situation which armed them all against another, which rendered their possessions as burdensome as their wants, and which no one could expect any safety either in poverty or riches, meaning living in this world where you have property but no state to secure it, he being the rich man, easily invented specious arguments to bring them over to his purpose, to try and get people to unite in the cause of a single political society. Let us unite, he said, to secure the weak from oppression, restrain the ambitious, and secure to every man the possession of what belongs to him. Let us form rules of justice and of peace to which all may be obliged to conform, and which shall give no preference to anyone, but may in some sort make amends for the caprice of fortune, by submitting alike the powerful and the weak to the observance of mutual duties. In a word, instead of turning our forces against ourselves, let us collect them into a sovereign power, which may govern us by wise laws, may protect and defend all the members of the association, repel common enemies, and maintain perpetual concord and harmony among us. This is the imagined, as it were, discourse that Russo sees at the beginning of the state. We might call it a lie, or at least an act of cynical self-interest. I'm going to strike as someone who has more than you, recognizing that in a state of nature where there are no laws, what is to prevent you from coming and taking it from me? I managed to convince you that wouldn't it be better if we could all come into some kind of civil society, and that it will benefit all of us, rich and poor alike, that the poor who have almost nothing are as well served as the well-off when they move inside of a political society by virtue of these mechanisms of peace, concord, self-preservation, and the like. And all, according to Rousseau, says, gladly offered their necks to the yoke, thinking they were securing their liberty. And we willingly then comply, right? The notion of civil society is something of granting benefit to all equally, is then accepted by the people who buy into this lie. Such was or must have been, writes Rousseau, the origin of society and of law, which gave few fetters to the weak and new power to the rich, irretrievably destroyed natural liberty, fixed forever the laws of property, and inequality changed an artful usurpation into an irrevocable right. That's a very extraordinary state. If you own something outside of the laws that protect it, what is your right to what you own? be it land or a title or lineage, or whatever it may be, right? You have no right. It means nothing. It is secured by, isn't secured by anything. But once you can move it within the apparatus of the state, all of those things, which are merely random and happenstance, a function of the kinds of inequality that emerge through these evolutionary processes, now what happens to them? Instead of being artful usurpation, I managed to steal a couple of horses and acquire some land and got myself a title and so on. What do they become? Irrevocable right. I have the right to these things. This is who I am. This defines my standing inside of this society. The civil law being thus become the common rule of citizens, the law of nature no longer obtained except between the different societies. So the law of nature as it defines people now disappears and only reemerges between different states. We'll pick up that again as well when we come to Kant's discussion on the perpetual peace, trying to end conflict between countries, a sort of international relations problem. How do we define peaceful relationships between nation states in the way that we define peaceful relations between people inside of a civil society? We'll pick up on that concept very directly. He says, I know that several writers have assigned other origins to political society, as we've seen already. That which I have just laid down, however, seems to be the most natural for the following reasons. First, the right of conquest is not a right at all, simply random. Second, the words strong and weak are ambiguous and better referred to the words rich and poor. Third, because the poor having nothing but their liberty to lose, it would have been the height of madness in them to give it up willingly, the only blessing they had left without obtaining some consideration for it. They must have been in some way tricked into thinking that civil society was going to grant them something, right? It must have been an act of deceit, essentially, this idea of civil society, serving the interests of a very few over and against the interests of the vast majority. How could they have accepted such a contract, such an agreement? And so they were tricked into, they bought into the language that was being spoken. They were told that this will be for mutual benefit, self-preservation, etc. But it was a lie. Instead, the purpose of civil society was to enshrine in a more stable sense the privileges that had accrued to a few and leave everybody else perpetually excluded, not as a matter now of circumstance, but now as a matter of law, as a matter of institutional structure. Politicians argue in regard to the love of liberty with the same sophistry that philosophers do in regard to the state of nature. By the things they see, they judge of things very different, which they have never seen, and they attribute to men a natural inclination to slavery on account of the patience with which the slaves within their notice bear the yoke. By slave, he means all of us who live inside of a civil society, unless you happen to be at the very top of that civil society. But that's not true. That does not mean because we accept this condition of extraordinary inequality as it is arrayed inside of our societies, that we are therefore naturally inclined to be slaves. Who was it? Who's he talking about there? Who said that we are naturally, or that this is a natural inclination? If we want to live outside of natural right and instead live inside of natural law? Who said that we are willing to essentially give up all of our freedom that we may have peace? Hobbes, exactly, right? Hobbes argues the fact that the basis of the state rests upon the capacity of human reason for us to recognize that living enslaved inside the state, by enslaved I mean not having liberty, is in fact a feature of who we are. Because Hobbes, as he says, not having seen any alternative, this is what he assumed to be the case. He says, it appears to me, I'm almost done. He says, it appears to me incontestably true that not only governments did not begin by arbitrary power, which is but the corruption and extreme term of government, and at length brings it back to the law of the strongest, against which governments were at first the remedy. But even that, supposing they had begun in this manner, such power being illegal in itself could never have served as a foundation for social law, nor, of course, for the inequality that it instituted. And so we come, actually, I have one last quote I'd like to read you, or maybe two. There's two. I'll do one. He says, this is the last term of inequality. So inequality, so let's retrace our argument. There is no inequality here. There's no meaning, it doesn't mean anything. We simply live in a state of equilibrium, securing our existence, a kind of timeless existence. Doesn't mean I get what I need for today, I don't worry about tomorrow and so on. And nature provides, as she does all animals, the means in order for me to attain my life. But because I have this capacity for shaping as well as being shaped by my environment. And I have the capacity to solve problems by recourse to my perfectibilité. Over time, it's inevitable that humanity, human beings will evolve, they will change. They can't remain in that original state. It's not like we did anything wrong or anything bad or anything external happened. Just by virtue of our own selves, it was inevitable that things were going to change. As things changed, gradually they moved into this condition, which then eventually led to a regime of property rights, of some people having more and some people having less. But it didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually through the acquisition of concepts that make property possible. The idea of something having value, the idea of esteem, reputation, and so on. We might also add perhaps this idea of future, for instance, might be part of that. Once that idea then of property starts to exist inside of our society, some have more, some have less. The state is an extremely convenient way for those who have more to safeguard, to institutionalize, to enshrine their privilege over and against the lack of possession, the lack of privilege that everybody else has. Because the state now takes what's been acquired as a result of happenstance, circumstance, and now it gives it the force of law. This is your title, this is your land, this is the deed that you have to it. And so it makes it, as it were, permanent. It gives it institutional legitimacy. And once it has institutional legitimacy, it then is normal. Some are destined to leave, some will have more, some will have less. This is simply how it is. The state is a reflection of nature. No, it isn't. The state is an evolution out of nature as a function of this process. This is the last term of inequality, the extreme point which closes the circle and meets that from which we set out. It is here that all private men return to their primitive equality because they are nothing, and that subjects having no longer any law but the will of their master, nor the master any law but his passions, all notions of good and principles of justice again disappear. This is when everything returns to the sole law of the strongest, what we might call tyranny, and of course to a new state of nature, different from that which we began, inasmuch as the first was the state of nature in its purity, and this is the consequence of excessive corruption. As you will discover as you're going through the work on Locke, there's a point, if we move into tyranny, and it's true for Hobbes as well, that we get thrown back into the state of nature for Hobbes and for Locke, right? There's a point where civil society can no longer be assessed as legitimate because power is being exercised over us in a way that is a fundamental violation of our sovereign rights as individuals. And for Hobbes and for Locke, this is the moment we go back into a state of nature. Tyranny puts us back into that state of nature. There is no law. There's just the whim, the caprice of a single powerful individual. But note what Rousseau says, that yes, tyranny puts you back into the state of nature, but it's not the original state of nature. It's a new state of nature. This new state of nature embeds within it all of the changes, all of the trappings, all of the things that have happened to us over the last who knows how many generations, having taught us then the idea that we can be envious, that reputation matters, that self-esteem, that the esteem of others is important, that value, that money, that these things are things that we should be coveting, trying to acquire, etc. When we go back into the state of nature at a moment of tyranny, we carry all of that with us into the state of nature. And therefore, coming back to what we noted at the beginning, we are as unlike this guy as you could possibly be, because we're equipped now with concepts and ideas that that original man could not possibly have understood. Civilized man, he says, is always in motion, perpetually sweating and toiling, racking his brains to find out occupations still more laborious. He continues to be a drudge to his last minute. He courts death to be able to live or renounces life to acquire immortality. He pays court to men in power whom he hates and to rich men whom he despises. He sticks at nothing to have the honor of serving them. He boasts proudly of his baseness and their protection, and proud of his slavery, and speaks with disdain those who have not the honor of sharing it. In other words, those who live inside of a society boast of the fortune that that society has granted and feel themselves superior to what Rousseau calls the sauvage, the person who lives in nature, the savage. The savage lives within himself, whereas social man constantly outside himself. The savage knows only, the civilized man knows only how to live in the opinions of others. And it is, if I may say so, merely from their judgment of him that he derives the consciousness of his own existence. Civilization literally alienates us from ourselves. It turns us into slaves who are unaware of the slavery that surrounds us. It deprives us of a liberty, and yet also deprives us of the capacity to see that we are not free. This is the idea of we are born free, but everywhere we are in chains. And for Russo then, the great challenge, the great political challenge going forward is not a question of the mechanics of the political society that we should construct, although that matters. It's a question of consciousness. Who do we want to be? How should we feel as individuals inside of this civil society? We can never be free, but once we've encountered civilization, civilization will inevitably make us unfree. There's nothing we can do about that. It's simply an irrevocable, irreversible feature of how we've evolved. But insofar as we are destined to be unfree by virtue of having become civilized, meaning lived in some kind of a civil society, the idea then is how can we foster a consciousness that makes us as free as possible, that simulates that idea of a pure, uncorrupted liberty. Maybe we might call it a freedom that is compatible with reason. And so when we come to the social contract, that's exactly what we find Rousseau's concern with is in the pages of that book. He lays out some mechanics of how we should come together and so on. But the mechanism that he comes up with, this notion of the general will, think about what it means, the idea of will, volonté, the idea of will. It speaks to that question of consciousness, of how we see ourselves and how we understand ourselves. And so for Rousseau, the great challenge of politics, of the political question in the 18th century moving forward, was not this enlightenment question of let's let reason guide us into some kind of utopian political future, but instead let's recognize that reason is a lot of why we're here, why we're in this mess. So now let's instead conceive of a model of liberty that can accommodate what human reason has thrown up, creating property and all the rest of it, and see what kind of a political society we can construct out of that. And that essentially then is the project he lays out in the pages of the social contract. What would such a system look like? And if you want a foretaste, you can go back, as I mentioned, to the dedication of the book, in which he lies about what the Republic of Geneva actually, or looks like, because it doesn't look anything like it describes it. But there you'll see at the beginning of the book is a description of an ideal society, which although, as he says, it places people in a yoke, meaning it restricts them, it holds them down. Nonetheless, the yoke is not unpleasant. It doesn't make us feel bad. It's, as he calls it, an easygoing or honorable yoke, right? That the laws that hold us down, that restrict us, nonetheless are not incompatible with being able to be more than we are at the moment. So by conclusion, this notion of inequality, where does it come from? It comes from civil society itself. And it is a symbol of the restrictions that are placed on the freedoms that we're all entitled to as a feature of our true nature. And we've not been able to construct a political discourse that lays bare that basic fact because we've never made the effort to actually think about what our real history is, what our history really tells us. And now that Jean-Jacques Rousseau has written this, now we can suddenly see things in a very, very different way. And I think it's that kind of gesture, which is why he's so influential on people like Kant, and we'll see particularly, for example, in Marx as well. And so, anyway, okay, let's stop there. I've said my piece. We're done. Thank you very much for those who are following online. Have a great week. I'll see you guys, I believe, next week. Or the week after, I don't remember.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Did everybody sign my signage sheet? These?
Yeah.
Sam, Lucas, Christian, and yeah, okay, well, good. Okay, thank you. I'll see you guys next week. Good luck with your lock essays.
Is there good faith grading on that one?
There is not good faith grading on that one.
Okay. Which essay in that category would need good faith grading?
Pops.